All right, so we're going to start on rendering. And guess what the first thing I'm going to do with rendering is? I'll give you one guess. No guesses? Eyes. That's actually kind of right, but the first thing I'm going to do now that I've come back to this piece after a little time off is I'm just going to recheck my major proportions now that I have fresh eyes and see if there's any big changes in these forms. You know, maybe my bag squished things a little, maybe I just had them wrong. But I'm just going to take my profile view and kind of work on that contour for a second. You know, and just make sure that I've got everything. I'm looking at the neck a little bit. Just make sure that I've got everything where I want it, okay? Make sure that I haven't left anything alone, or that it hasn't changed too radically on me. So I noticed that the front of my neck wasn't long enough. This hair was a little bit out of whack, like as far as the angles. So I'm just going to take like a couple minutes to come in and fix that. And it's honestly something I'm going to keep. I'm going to look at my other views too, my front views, and kind of do a similar thing with some nice fresh eyes, just if there's any big movements or angles on those forms that I need to play with. And it might be cutting, it might be adding, right? Might be cutting, might be adding. I think I've got the hair on mine a little too floofy, so I'm just going to trim that down. So spend a little bit doing that, and then yes, whoever said eyes is totally correct, but not the whole eye yet. My next stage is just going to be to start to give myself the sense of an eye, because that's visually going to help me direct where I go. So the thing I want to look at before I add the eye is the socket, okay? And if you look at the skull, what you'll notice is that the bottom of the socket is like a shelf, right? It runs almost straight back in. There's just a little lip there on the top of the cheekbone. And that then the brow ridge itself actually has a bony protrusion that comes out, okay? So I'm just going to remind you, right? The brow ridge tends to be out in front of the cheekbone. This is skull-wise, not flesh-wise. But the brow, the orbital ridge right here, tends to be inside of the width of the cheekbone, right? So we want that relationship. And I'm going to check that I have it relative to my model, right? So what that means is I'm going to look at my profile picture and I'm going to look at that angle between the brow ridge and the cheekbone. And I'm going to see if I have a similar angle. And if not, I'm going to create it either by adding or subtracting from one of those two things, okay? Then I'm going to look at my front picture and look at the protrusion of the cheekbone outside of the brow ridge, and I'm going to notice that I don't have that, so I'm going to section in. You may need to add cheekbone. You might want to section in the side of the skull a little bit. See, I've got it over here, just not over here. So I'm going to go ahead and start to work that. Before I put the eyes in, I'm working the sockets, is the point, okay? So I'm going to look at this plane. I don't know if you can see it on the picture, but there's a little crease here between the shadow, and then there's a little plane there. I want to make sure that this angle feels like what I see, right? And then also I'm going to look at the kind of openness of the top of the brow ridge. there's a shadow right there, and I want that same shadow. So I'm going to go ahead and start to close down the socket a little bit and get it closer to the shape that I see here. Not the lid part, but that overall curve, right, on the outside. So I'm going to start to close down the socket, and what this is this little bone right here. Okay? So I'm just starting to bring that socket forward. Now, I don't want to close it down all the way. Bring it all the way forward, right? If that bone were all the way forward, then I wouldn't see any of the eye, right? So you should have space back from the inside of the eye where it meets the nose and here. So I'm looking for that amount of distance and that angle, right? Just closing down the socket a little bit, looking at my pictures to do that. And I think I actually want a little bit more angle, like that. That seems pretty good. And I'm going to give a little more rise to the cheekbone too. So I'm looking at that picture and just adjusting the corner of that socket. Okay. Once I've done that, kind of frame the socket in more according to my model. In, out, in, edge. Then I'm going to go ahead and throw a little pretend eyeball in there. And so as we do that, the thing we want to think about the eyeball is that on our skulls, it is bigger than the socket, right? That's how it doesn't fall out. So I want a pretty good wad of clay in there to create the eyeball. And the first thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to look at my picture and I'm going to gauge from the brow ridge, how far back does my eyeball sit, right? So I want to think about that distance between the brow ridge and the bridge of the nose and how far back the eyeball sits, okay? Which is a lot further than that. So this tool, the back of your big knife, the scoop part is really great for this. I can start to just push that clay back. And now if it's still not sitting far enough back, which it's not in my case, I can take a little clay off the front until I get it to the place in space where I want it, which I think is more about there, okay? Now, our eyeballs sit high in the sockets, and because our sockets are open more left to right, we see more of the curvature left to right, right? More of that sphere is exposed left to right. So I'm going to use the back end of that tool, and I'm just going to start to curve a little bit. Because the eyeball sits high in the socket, I want a slight curve at the bottom, and I want a harder curve to the left and right, okay? And what I'm trying to do is make the apex of the curve sit right about there, right? I'm trying to make that the highest point of my eyeball, okay? So, big eyeball, fill the socket. If the socket's the right size, it should be the right size eyeball. Okay. I'm going to do that both sides and then we'll move on.